Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. Today we're going to delve once again into the story aspects of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla with several pieces of news and our interpretation of them, always keeping in mind that the DLC story beyond the mythological veil should be about the first civilization. Thus, minor spoiler alert here, you've been warned. In the video we're going to delve into the more public and official side of Odin's journey to Svartalfheim as opposed to his personal story, with a focus on the Relic / Piece of Eden quest shown in the recently released footage. We're also going to add some new details about this quest coming from a hands-off demo that we witnessed a few weeks ago, including some interesting narrative setups concerning Loki and Surtr. And finally, we're also going to add way more information about the story elements connected to the Valkyrie Arena that will make an appearance in the DLC and will give Odin even more chances to show how obnoxious and full of himself he really is. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's dive right in and have a look at the story news for the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So, within the narrative framework of the DLC, at least for what we understood based on the information out there, Odin will follow two paths. A, for lack of better wording, an outside or more official journey where he will have to locate the hidden shelters, help the remaining dwarves / Svartalfheim Isu and get help for them as well, and a more personal story, the one that involves Baldr, his son. As for the journey involving the dwarves, we already mentioned in our first gameplay related video that it's thanks to them that Odin will receive an artifact called the Huggerrip, which will enable him to draw new powers from the defeated enemies. I'm not sure how that translates to the Isu meta story, and as suggested by Jeux Video magazine, the Huggerrip is likely based on the famous golden ring called Draupnir from the Norse mythology, which was forged by the dwarves Brok and Eitri or Sindri, whom we mentioned already in our gameplay first look, and who are, thus, likely to appear in the DLC and are probably the ones shown in this part of the deep dive trailer. A part of this official journey was shared in a recent hands-off demo that we witnessed and through some footage provided by Ubisoft, where we were able to see a few chunks of a quest which you might have seen in our uncommented walkthrough, and today we can discuss a bit of what we saw, including some dialogue that weren't part of the footage itself, which we took some notes about. So as we already mentioned in our previews, in this quest Odin has traveled to one of the oldest territories of Svartalfheim, which was ruled by Glod, Surtr's son. During the demo, we were actually told by producer Mariana Gosteva that within the DLC we might be seeing a good chunk of Surtr's family, including of course Surtr himself, the Isu represented by this unkillable fire giant, and always portrayed with this huge sword, which could be a sword of Eden, his wife Sinmara, whom we saw in the deep dive trailer and will be part of a boss battle, his son from another union, half Jotun and half Muspel called Glod, who is the villain of this specific quest, and while during the demo there wasn't any mention of Isa, the daughter of Surtr that will appear in the Forgotten Myths comic, I wonder if she actually made an appearance in the deep dive trailer. So in our specific quest, Odin was on the look for one of the remaining shelters, called Granhellir, where what we described as Isu engineers, here represented as dwarves, found refuge after the Muspel and Jotun invasion of the territory once controlled by them. His plan was to find the leader of the shelter, Ivaldi, the same character that he had enslaved and then freed during the Asgard arc of the main game, but when he finally reached the place, he found a female Isu, here called Gunborg, who was initially distrustful, but later revealed to be the leader of the shelter because Ivaldi, while trying to make contact with the other shelters, had been seemingly killed during an ambush by Glod's soldiers, and a quote-unquote creature that apparently ate him alive, whatever that could represent beyond the mythological veil. Odin in turn believed that this creature could have been created with Loki's aid, quote-unquote, before he could make him his captive, which seemingly hints at Odin actually putting Loki in some kind of jail at the start of the DLC, kinda like he did with his son Fenrir too. and I wonder how that ties in with the comic where Loki is actually working freely with Baldr in his attempt to seduce Surtr's daughter Isa. The main city close to the Grand Hellish shelter is called Uldar. Uldar fell to the invasion soon after Ivaldi was killed, and the Isu forges and locals had fallen under Glod's control or died, but apparently Glod did not kill all the dwarves or the Isu engineers because he needed them. In fact, within the mythological veil, the Muspels were forcing them to dig the rocks and grounds in order to try and find ancient relics buried deep in the ground that they believed to be very important. And of course we're talking about the pieces of Eden here, but what's interesting is that apparently this technology had been buried or hidden for a long time, so it's seemingly dated to some or much time prior to that of Odin, Loki, Jupiter, Juno, etc. So Gunborg told Odin that in Uldar there was a miner, Fritjof, who was gathering information for the dwarves about what the Muspels were looking for, and Odin just said that anything sought by the Muspels had to be his. How lovely. I keep disliking Odin's character more and more. I might accidentally have him die a few times in my playthrough just to spite him. But anyway, Odin set himself on finding Fritjof, not to save him, of course, but to find the relic that he wants, and indeed found some clues about his location in Uldar. The following part was actually in the demo that we witnessed and relies a bit more on my notes, so it might not be 100% precise. In one of the side dialogues, or shall I call them mutters to himself, Odin commented that he had visited Uldar in the past with Loki and Baldr when his son was just a boy, reflecting that now they were both captive. An interesting point of view considering that Odin would thus be both the jailer and supposedly the savior of a captive. Odin eventually found the house pointed by Gunborg, but also found signs of a fight that took place there, along with some unopened letters towards the sons of Ivaldi written by Fritjof and supposedly dealing with the risk that he was undertaking by writing to the shelter, but apparently these letters and some other ones sent by the sons of Ivaldi were left unopened as Fritjof was actually imprisoned. So Odin moved on to a dwarven foundry, which we can assume to be some kind of Isu mine or forge, and instead of Fritjof, he found Tyra, Fritjof's cousin, and apparently she, like Bridget from Valhalla's main game, seems to be talking quote-unquote unintelligibly. It seems like she's even the same voice actress.
Tyra! Fritjof!
Do you even know where he is?
Fritjof! Yeah! Fritjof! Tyra!
Wait.
One way or another, the two teamed up and Odin brought her out of the foundry/prison. But while getting outside, and again this was in the demo that we saw only, they heard some Muspel warriors talking about a noisy dwarf being promoted to a dig site, which is kind of a teaser for a character shown later, and especially that apparently at some point an Aesir defeated Surtr single-handedly. This is kinda interesting as it might mean that it was Baldr who did that and thus was imprisoned, or maybe Odin did clash with Surtr at the start of the expansion and temporarily came out on top. Anyway, once the two got out of the prison/foundry, the mission was stopped and fast forwarded to when Fritjof was found and freed from his imprisonment with a bandage over his eyes. He revealed that he was the one to find the quote-unquote relic in the ground that the Muspels were looking for, and that now they got it and took it to a nearby palace. When Fritjof removed the relic from the ground that he was excavating, a blast of light hit his eyes, hence why the bandage, and then the Muspels got the relic from him as well, but they also didn't know what this relic was about, and that's why they took it to the bastard scholar in the palace, which is Glod supposedly. Apparently, in this palace called Ragnarok Palace, Ivaldi had been commissioned there much time earlier than these events, but during Odin's visit to Svartalfheim, the palace was held by a traitor dwarf/Isu called Einar, who was actually collaborating with the Muspels/North African Isu. Thus, Odin left for the palace during a new quest called the Scholar and the Sunstone, and Sunstone might be the name of the mythological version of the Piece of Eden here, and when he entered the palace, he saw Glod threatening Einar, the traitor dwarf, because the relic that they were looking for had become dormant, and there was only one means to awaken it, but he didn't reveal it, of course. Einar said that he had searched all of Ivaldi's records, who had been mentioned in the main game as well, but couldn't find any help. So eventually Glod saw Odin and punched the ground to keep him at bay, then showed a tiny pouch, which possibly contained the artifact, before making him and Einar fall to the lower story of the palace, where the demo ended. So that is more or less a condensed version of the story of a chunk of a narrative arc of the DLC, but we do know even more story information about what we could find in Dawn of Ragnarok. For example, as we already mentioned in our videos dedicated to the gameplay side of the DLC, we know that Odin will stumble on a battle arena run by a Valkyrie called Kára, where he will be able to undergo a number of challenges. While some sources originally called these Trials of the Valkyrie, the more recent news reports are calling these challenges Tales, and there's a specific reason for that. In fact, the arena will be a place for Odin to reenact tales of his past victories by taking on waves of enemies and bosses. That is why it was mentioned that you might find familiar faces in there, because Odin might tell of his fights that we saw in the Asgard, Jotunheim and even Irish stories as well, but also the ones that Odin will undertake in Dawn of Ragnarok. In fact, according to game director Georgi Popov, when key events happen in the main storyline, a new tale will unlock for Odin, so the arena could also be a way to convey some narrative elements along with the classic waves of enemy fights, but with a twist. In fact, many news outlets are reporting that ahead of each fight, Odin and thus the players will be able to select up to 14 boasts, which are going to be pretty much challenge modifiers, which should keep the fight interesting for the Valkyries and thus the players that Odin is telling his tales to. So by selecting one or more boasts, Odin will embellish his story, making it bigger than it really was and thus pretty much boasting about his gestures. If you couple that with this mini video shared by the PlayStation blog, which shows that Odin himself asked to have an arena where he can recreate his finest moments, then that should once again show how full of himself this character really is. I just know I'm gonna root for the waves of enemies and see where we go from there. So yeah, there's still a chance to see the story of Hildur, the Valkyrie ancestor of the old lady Hildiran from the Mastery Challenge story, but even if it happens, it'll probably be clouded by Odin's embellishments. And that was it for the second part of all the story related news concerning the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla that we could gather, along with some of our own speculations about what we might expect to see inside of it. What about you? Did the story shown in the demo footage along with our additional details pique your interest, or are you still not convinced about the content of the DLC? Let us know in the comments below. Also, join us in our next video where we'll explore all the news about Odin's personal story in the DLC, Loki's plans, Baldr's potential death, and way more issue related information and theories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.